What is the objective? What could be the objective? Let's put it like this. I will speak a bit in good and hypothetical discussions, but to set up a cost-efficient and environmentally sound take-back system for PV panels. And as we talk about PV panels, we need to talk also about, in general, the PV system. So it also includes inverters, batteries, and other BUS elements. And as you know, or not know, but in Europe, inverters are also under the scope of the WEEE directive. Batteries are under the scope of a separate battery directive. And if you want to set up such a system, you have mainly two big options, starting options. You can do it on a voluntary basis as industry and show to the authorities that the US solar industry are able to manage the responsibility for the end of life phase of your products. And when required, you could then, in some years later, in the midterm, eventually support this by a kind of, I call it tailor-made producer responsibility legislation. That's an option. And it's an attractive option. The only, I would say, difficult point here is that it's a voluntary. So you will always then have companies who will join this voluntary initiative, but you could also have the situation that the majority is not joining it, and then you have not a level playing field in the market. And therefore, option two is, I would say, a bit the opposite, but do not be afraid of the opposite. It's a mandatory basis. So yes, there will be legislation in place, but you steer it by the PV industry itself, whereby you can say, okay, we have some targets in place. For instance, we set a clear recycling fee. We make it also visible, and it's paid by the end customer at the time of purchase. But the legal responsibility should be on the shoulder of the ones who sell the product for the first time in India. So it's really the financial responsibility at one hand, and at the other hand, the legal responsibility. And you can really make here already immediately a tailor-made producer responsibility legislation in cooperation, of course, with the authorities. Going to the next slide, please. And conclusion here as well. You saw also the red cross here in option one. I think if all the stakeholders, if everybody now in the call would make, I would say, if I would ask you, please decide now as we speak. You might all decide immediately for voluntary, in the thinking that okay, that will be then cheap and whatsoever. But as I said in the beginning, if you have a risk that 50% or more, 80% of the market will not join this voluntary initiative, then you all probably agree that it's better to have something which is stick to the wall, but which you still as industry can steer yourself and write yourself what has to be achieved. So you can go to the next slide, Subbu. So what could be then the strategy to put in place this, I would say, industrial initiative? Of course, you organize a nationwide take-back system, irrespective, as you saw in the slides of Subbu, that in some states in India, a lot of PV is installed, in other states a bit less. But anyway, option is to go nationwide immediately. You include all the products of a PV system, so the panels, the inverters, the batteries, and the BOS elements, but with a focus, of course, on the responsibility towards PV panels, inverters, and batteries. You take into account, yes, that the products at the end of life can be reused, at least must be recycled and properly treated. You can put in place a pay-as-you-put financing system with an advanced visible fee. So that means you sell today a product, you sell today a PV panel or inverter, you put it on the market, and you put immediately, let's say, I'm now speaking in a dollar or something, but you put immediately, you buy the product for $100 and you add $1 on top of it, so it costs at the end of the day $101, and the $1 is set aside in the take-back program, and then of course you can discuss how much of the $1 you need to use for current waste management and how much of the $1 you need for future waste management. And also in the setup, you of course have to set up what they call the PRO, a producer responsibility organization. So you need to set up a professional organization with at least steered by, I would say, a country manager or somebody who is taking the lead and is responsible to get everything in place. It could be supported by services rendered by us, but that's just an option. And what is important as well for India, that you use local companies, you use companies from India for the collection, the shipment, the recycling, the treatment, eventually also the reuse, and also very important, and this is what you saw in the slides of Subbu, Indian style, meaning in India as well, the waste pickers economy is a very important element in the market of let's say of waste management. When it would be possible, and when we integrate the waste pickers into such a take-back program, of course, we need to do it. But it might be a challenge. Come to this later. You can go to the next slide, Subbu. So, and if you would like to see a bit of an insight how it could look like, you can split up the responsibility and tasks into two legal entities. Why two legal entities? Well, you compile all your, I would say, the legal responsibles. You compile them all in one organization, which has as objective being non-for-profit. So it could be non-for-profit association. Now it's the working name. You can call it PRO Circular. And on the other hand, you also set up a private company which is organizing the purchase of all the services, like organizing the collection, organizing the shipment, the recycling, the treatment, and the reuse. And you can call this company PRO India. Just working names for the moment. Coming back to the non-for-profit association, who are their assets? Hear myself again. So who could be the so the assets of a non-for-profit association are the owners are the PV companies which are putting for the first time PV panels, inverters, and or batteries into the Indian market. So say they are the legal responsibles, and the task of that non-for-profit organization is really communicating, informing about PV industry, the circular solar economy, the take-back and recycling program for PV systems waste, being also an advisor to national and state authorities, and has, of course, as a geographical focus at the start, India. Also important, maybe not mentioned as such on the slide, but that also the non-for-profit association will be the owner of the financial assets, meaning of the money collected. This non-for-profit association will be the owner of that money, so that at the end of the day, it's the PV industry who is managing its own take-back program, and is also managing and defining at the end of the day what is the amount of the recycling fee, also when it has to be changed, because you can start with a recycling fee of $1 and maybe over time it becomes $0.50, and maybe over time it becomes 25 cents. But this is all decisions taken by a board of directors within this non-for-profit association, PRO Circular. So this non-for-profit association will be, I would say, the key, the driving legal entity of the two legal entities. And then the other legal entity, the private company, is then really the company which is purchasing, it's kind of purchase company, purchasing the services of collection, shipment, treatment of the PV panels. And of course, a very important condition, but that will come over time, of course, that there is an amount of volume of waste, because that's one of the main challenges. The good news is that PV panel and also inverters, but mainly PV panels, have a very long lifetime, which means also today there is barely waste. And the waste market is driven by volume. So to make interesting deals with the waste and recycling business, you need volume, and they are more interested to see every day 1,000 tons coming into their plants instead of 1 ton per day. And last point, the services also need to apply for all PV systems. It's very important. So if you would set up such a take-back program, then immediately it applies to all PV panels, all inverters, all batteries, irrespectively if it's installed now in a residential PV power plant or a very large B2B PV power plant or an SPV or the like. So it fits to every PV panel, because at the start, when a PV panel is sold, nobody can tell upfront where this PV panel will end up, on the residential rooftop or in a big PV power plant. And next slide, Subbu, please. And this is then the same slide again, but a bit visualized in a different visual, where you see on top the non-for-profit circular legal entity, which is really, as I said in the previous slide, the management organization, which defines the strategy, which defines the financial plan, defines the recycling fee, and manage also the financial assets. And really is yeah, I would say contracting then the executing organization, Pro India, for example, and this purchase or executing organization is then executing all the strategy and all the decisions taken by the management organization, and does this on their behalf and under control of the management organization. So that at the end of the day, the management organization is has the control on everything, but in a way they do not daily work. That's the bit the objective here, because as well the PV companies are as such not that's not their core business of managing this on a daily basis. But of course, there has to be a clear framework in which the management organization, through a board of directors, takes the key decisions and steers everything. Next slide, please, Subbu. And yeah, then the next big topic is a bit, what about cost? For those familiar with the PV panel, this slide might be, yeah, why are you showing this? For those less familiar with the PV panel, I try to remind you that a PV panel is a very nice product, but from a material perspective, from an end-of-life perspective, from a waste perspective, from a recycling perspective, it's really glass. It's a laminated glass product, which mainly contains, yeah, here on the slide you see 78, 80, 85, depending on which technology we talk about. But the message is very clear. 3/4 of the weight of the product is glass, just glass. And then, yes, second big item of it, the aluminium frame, and then you have a bit of plastics, and then you have a bit of metals and semiconductors, under which you find then the silicon, the silver, the copper wires, and the like. But if you would show here a slide of an electronic equipment, a laptop, a TV set, washing machine, and whatever, you would see there that the 80% is metals, and the rest limited is a bit plastics. So very important to remind it that at the end of the day, we're talking here about a laminated flat glass product, and not about a metal product with some plastics, like the classical electronic products. Next slide, please. And if you would now have expected that we show you immediately all the costs and etc., that's of course today also not possible. But I just wanted to share with you this slide to show you. You might all think immediately, yeah, PV panel, there is some silver in it, some copper in it, some other interesting metals. So at the end of the day, this is a gold mine. Well, I would like to bring you to planet Earth. No, it's not a gold mine. You need to be realistic. There are some materials inside which are interesting, of course, but they are inserted in a laminated product which is built to last for 20 years or more in an outside environment. That's one thing. Now, the other hand, you also have costs. and it's sometimes, and it's mainly forgotten in a lot of take back discussions, you have costs. And to set up the whole thing, you see that the last bullet point, you have administration costs, you have reporting costs, you have in general overhead costs, one element. And then you of course have the more operations costs like the collection, in general, the logistics, and then also of course the treatment costs, because to get silicon or copper or silver out of a PV panel, it's not like you blow it with your air and you blow to it and it's and you recover everything. No, you really need to get into it. You need to treat the product, and preferably on an environmentally sound manner, to extract the metals, the glass, plastics, and other materials. So at the end of the day, yes, it's a balance between the value and cost. And if at the end of the day, this take-back system is able to deliver a zero-cost solution for the PV industry, it already achieves a very, very, very nice target. If, of course, within, I don't know, 50 years from now or 30 years from now, we are able that the value of the materials is really, there is a value and you get some income from this, maybe it can cover all the costs on the right side. But it could also a situation that at the other side, the costs are not covered by the value of the materials and that you still have a minimal cost. So that's the statement also, to achieve and go for a zero cost solution. But except when you really would collect gold constantly, 100% pure gold, then yes, I can guarantee you that the value of the material will cover all the costs. That's for sure. But with a PV panel, I think if this balance is already like this, equal, that would already be a big achievement. Can go to the next slide, Subbu. And then yes, if you then really want to see what could be a recycling fee, how could it look like, what could be the cost? Very important to first take into account some assumptions, and that's also why we have at the end of the session some questions for you to really bit have your feeling about some of these assumptions. Here we took into account that if the take-back system would be in place in India, you have 50% of the market share in year one. So not immediately the complete market will be compliant. It will take some time. We need to be realistic. But assuming this, half of the market is in, assuming that 10 gigawatt will be installed in the period between 2020 and 2024 per year, very important, 10 gigawatt per year during 4 to 5 years. Taking into account, for example, this is now in euros, but that you have today a cost of 115 euros per ton for transport and treatment in India. Probably it's a bit higher, but just this is an assumption. And then a very important question, bullet point 4, that's also why it's written to be decided. Are you willing as industry to foresee costs also for the historical waste? So the waste, the panels which are already installed before today, because Subbu explained clearly, there is already 34 gigawatt installed. This 34 gigawatt is not financed at all today. So what are you going to do with it as industry? Do you want to finance it? When yes, and then is the question, okay, how are we going to do it? There are solutions for this, but it's a very important element in also defining at the end the fee. We take into account also a return rate of 0.01%. And in general, we assume that only 80% of what is installed will return, because why the 20 other percent will be gone? Yes, it will be gone due to fire, weather, hurricane, maybe installations which will be removed and which will be sold to other locations, other countries and whatever. So you always have a situation where not the 100% which was sold comes 100% back into the waste bin. Then an unknown assumption today, the profit of the materials. And then is the question, when there is a profit maybe in the materials and a value, which materials will generate value? A very unpredictable factor today, and we saw it the last 5-6 years in the waste business, and not only due to COVID. COVID is only one of the elements, but in the last 5 years, a lot of materials which were previously during 20, 30 years generating a value, the last 5 to 6 years suddenly they generated a loss or a minus, and that could also be due to geopolitical decisions. For example, the fact that China decided to stop importing some waste flows 2 years ago, well, that had a huge impact around the globe. And instead of prices which were generating money or costs which were not there, suddenly there was a cost factor for some waste flows which could not be shipped anymore to China. And these are all things which you can, with all respect, not predict today. And another assumption is that we do a visible fee paid by the end customer. And if we then to take into account that we want to foresee some provisions for the future waste management of PV panels, then we come up today with a potential recycling fee per PV panel sold of the amount you see there, 3.95 rupees per piece or 0.05 euro per piece. Again, that would generate some provisions for the future at a range of 5, almost 6%. So that clearly tells you not 100% of everything will be financed. No, you build it up gradually, but taking all these things into account, this could be a potential amount of a recycling fee. Next slide, please. And we only have two slides left, and then we can start into the questions. Lessons learned in general, what I also want to share with you, in general to the PV industry in India. Overcome, and that's based upon now 11 years experience from us here in Europe, overcome the differences by focusing on the challenge. Because at the end of the day, at the recycling yard, nobody cares if there is a PV panel with a high efficiency or a low efficiency or mid efficiency or whatever efficiency. At the end of the day, at the recycling yard, they are just looking to what is lying there. Which material? Is it glass, aluminium, ferro, non-ferro, plastics, and how much? And that's the common objective you need to strive for. You need to find a solution for the waste. So the brand of a PV panel means nothing at all at the recycling yard. Secondly, do not consider EPR, extended producer responsibility. That's the official beautiful name for what we are talking about. Do not consider this EPR as an element of competition. And thirdly, also realize you are not alone. If this will be imposed to the industry, the electronics sector, the car sector, batteries, packaging, tires, in a lot of countries around the globe, this is already since many years in place. And this industry is still there. It's not the end of the world, not at all. But what is important is to find a good balance between ecology and the economics, of course, in order that the industry has reasons to still be there and to survive. And a last important lesson learned, and that's also why you as industry, you are important to get this done. It's up to you. It's the industry who must define the boundaries and the framework regarding the financing model. Because at the end of the day, it's very important ecology, but at the end of the day, it's a big discussion always about money and about financing and about funding. So it's important that also the industry makes up their minds, and you will also see it in the questions we have, which we are curious to see what is your opinion a little bit about this. Next slide, please. And the last slide almost is more the recommendation. Realize that if you set this up, that it will cost a bit of money. So there is no free lunch for nothing. So it costs money to do this. Combine the efforts. It's better to combine the efforts than to state, yeah, we'll do this on my own and whatever. Just realize, how can you guarantee that you will collect your panels you have put on the market from the north of India, the west, the east, and the south, and that you will all organize it alone? Well, I would say good luck, but it will cost you much more than if you would combine this with some of your competitors in a take-back system. Also important that it's not always producer responsibility that, yeah, the one who's putting it for the first time on the market who is responsible. Yes, he is legally responsible, but it's also still an international principle that the polluter pays. So putting a visible fee on the invoice, the recycling fee on the invoice is allowed, and as such does not generate an item. So, and then I would say as a fourth recommendation, start with a limited number of companies, leading companies, and leading, I do not mean always the tier 1 companies. It can be tier 1, but also tier 2s, tier 3s. Make sure that you have the whole value chain from manufacturer to distributor, EPC contractor, a bit in your starting group to set this up. 4 point I already mentioned, and when you would set up a voluntary system, then legislation is only required when the industry is unable to deliver, let's say. But I already mentioned it. I think voluntary system is a very challenging system for a product with such a long lifetime. And last point, yeah, we at PV Cycle, we already invented the wheel for PV. So please, you can use our existing experience in take back and treatment and financing of PV panels.